Given all the turmoil at KTM over the MotoGP off-season, you might have thought they might try to keep a bit of a low profile for their launch, but no, they put up their entire rider lineup, team bosses, and motorsport boss Pit Beirer to talk at the unveiling of their 2025 Tech 3 and KTM racing programs. Val, it was a strange day of KTM interviews, wasn't it? There was a whole vibe of don't talk about the elephant in the room, don't talk about the elephant in the room, and then suddenly you could.
Yeah, it was a strange day. It was a very long day. Obviously, we've had multiple interviews spanning several hours, and for most of them, the warning from the KTM press team was, please do not ask any other riders or any of the team bosses about the financial side, with the caveat that Pit Beirer, the motorsport boss, is coming at the end of the day, and he'll talk to you about it. And he did, and he talked about it extensively, and actually, just listening to him speak and listening to what he has to say, obviously, it's all in the air. It's not fully in KTM's hands. KTM is in self-administration right now. It is going through insolvency proceedings. It is in that 90-day process of where it needs to come up with a restructuring plan. It needs to come up with solutions that will satisfy, creditors, satisfy potential investors, basically, to keep the company on track. And racing always becomes expendable in that sort of scenario. But the message today from Pit Beirer was that there is an initial understanding and certainly a lot of optimism. So when push comes to shove and when that restructuring plan is either approved or denied, that it probably will be approved, and that it will be approved with still a major racing component. So if, from the outside, just looking at it without hearing from senior KTM figures, you just assume, it's such a money sink. There's so much going into it, and KTM hasn't won meaningfully in MotoGP yet, that it would hit the chopping block first. Well, that was not the tone from Mr. Beirer today, and he spoke a lot, and he spoke with a lot of detail. They did not shy away from the tough questions, but it sounds like they expect good news and they feel they have good news.
This was the first kind of firm point of information after this really strange winter for MotoGP fans, where there'd been so much kind of rumour and conjecture and these kind of administrators and financial officials reports that seemed to suggest a MotoGP exit was certain, and it was just a question of timing, even some suggestions it could be almost instantly. We discussed a few times on the Roast MotoGP podcast the idea that maybe the tactic here could be just keep stringing the racing program along, keep it alive until suddenly what seemed inevitable doesn't have to be inevitable anymore, and somehow it keeps going. It feels like that was kind of what Pit Beirer might have been getting at in terms of let's just keep going for now because maybe this rescue will rescue the racing team too.
Well, I don't think this is how they want to phrase it necessarily. There's certainly a kernel of truth to it, but in my understanding, basically, the position of the KTM racing program is that we have a long-term case study of motorsport success working for us as a driver of business. So this is why you would not, chop the MotoGP part of things, because it is not a vanity project. It brings customers in. It, just like other motorsport successes bring customers in, we believe that this is an integral part of the business. And, that currently the people in charge of the self-administration process also feel that way. Pit Beirer feels, and from his tone, certainly he expects potential investors, creditors, etc., to understand that and feel that way also. If February 25th goes wrong, still absolutely anything could happen. Probably a scenario where they somehow don't race. Although if they don't race, obviously then there will be financial penalties, presumably on the MotoGP side with Dorna, because there's an existing valid contract. So it's also not that simple as just packing up and saving everything you can. But the tone generally has been pretty bullish from everybody, even from the riders and team bosses who weren't necessarily allowed to speak about the financial aspect of things. But, we media are tricky, so we'll ask in roundabout ways. We'll go, how's your mindset, etc. What sort of assurances have you had? And basically, all to one, the full answers were, great mindset, full assurances. All the development that we'll need is there, and we don't even need that much development because actually Ducati isn't that far ahead. That kind of rhetoric, very positive. Clearly, it's been a very difficult winter for everybody involved. It could not be without the headlines, even if your day-to-day isn't affected by that, even if the racing department has been somewhat insulated. And we know they've made cuts, but so far they haven't been performance cuts. A report of a development freeze has been disputed in a way. Pit Beirer says that the development freeze that was in place was just because the engine freeze for 2 years that KTM was a major driver of is kicking off right now, which is why, the KTM engine's already really good. So the engine that they need, they have for 25 and 26 right now. So there's no crisis-related stoppage of development. They're just, they're pretty bullish about having what they need to take on Ducati and to not just, go racing for the sake of fulfilling a contractual obligation, but to go racing to win.
Yeah, it was very impressive how many ways the media, yourself included, found to ask the riders and team managers the questions about KTM's situation without them sounding like questions about KTM's situation. But like you say, the responses were almost business as usual in a way you could kind of believe that the riders, I guess they have to put this sort of focused mindset on where they just trust their managers to be getting fallback plans in place in case the KTM MotoGP situation completely turns to dust. But listen to people like Pedro Acosta, Brad Binder, Maverick Vinales today, it almost sounded like any MotoGP off-season with a team in KTM's position of being one of the kind of top challengers to Ducati. It was almost business as usual.
I mean, I asked Maverick Vinales about, sort of a tough time at KTM and rallying the troops, and he almost rejected the premise of my question out of hand. He's like, what tough times? KTM has won Dakar, KTM was winning in American Supercross. What tough times are you talking about? Well, he didn't quite phrase it that way, but certainly that's the vibe they want to get forward. And I struggled to believe it for much of the day because they hadn't had Bayer yet. So it's more like this is the approach you would take in front of the media, right? You're not going to admit weakness. You're not going to admit you're, worried about your contractual situation, whatever. But, with the positivity that's come through from Breyer, if they share that, if he has been able to convince them that, yes, actually, the project will have what it needs, almost certainly, and that you're not just wasting 2 years of your prime on a project that doesn't have the money that it needs to be competitive. Because, again, there's a huge distinction between showing up to just fill out the grid with 4 bikes, 4 same looking bikes that will now be completely the same livery, but they're, are running at the back or are dropping back with every round because they're not being developed. There's a huge difference between that and, actually going racing to win, because that's what all 4 of those guys are for. None of them, except for Acosta, are hungry up-and-comers. All of them need to win now. And Acosta, despite being a young, hungry up-and-comer, is also not going to wait around. He needs to win now.
It is an incredible lineup. It's really interesting over the winter as the crisis element has taken over the KTM narrative. It's led us to sort of forget just how strong this lineup is. When KTM signed Bastianini and Vinales, promoted Acosta at the same time, you looked at that lineup and thought no other manufacturer actually has this depth or this shortage of weak links in its lineup. But it has also been interesting listening to the interviews today. The whole crisis situation exploded to a degree during the off-season. There were murmurs towards the end. People were being asked about it towards the end of the races. But actually, it's mostly been during the riders' winter holidays that the whole scale of the crisis and its potential repercussions have really become apparent. Pit Byra was the only one who really spoke about that, but he did kind of reveal how things built up from his side, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And there was apparently a suspicion in the summer that things weren't quite going the right way on the KTM business side, that, the market wasn't developing the way they wanted it to, that the bicycle part of the business was, just not working out because that particular market was in a lot of strife. And the way Pit Byra phrased it is, if those cues weren't picked up at that point, if the savings that could be made at that point, not breaking contracts, but scaling down within the contractual framework, if that wasn't done then, the situation would be somehow much more precarious now, and potentially maybe the racing project would not have been saved. But now, for the time being, it is saved. Obviously, we're waiting for February 25th, but right now this is a company that insists it is not just ready to go racing and ready to go racing competitively in a very difficult, very expensive championship, but even 2027 is not out of the question. Because obviously, Pit Byra was asked about 2027, the new MotoGP regulations coming in. And remarkably, I for sure expected an answer that's like, too early, wait a little bit, please. We're firefighting a crisis. What do you mean new bikes? And that was part of the answer. But the other part was, yeah, we want to do it. And we still have engineers looking at the project. We're still, we're committing resource to it. Our expectation and our long-term plan still includes MotoGP in 2027, which, again, let's wait for February 25th, but it's good news for KTM. It's certainly good news for its racing program. It's really good news for MotoGP.
I think it's worth just putting into context what is February 25th. We mentioned it a few times. This is like the next hurdle in the administration process, effectively, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is when the restructuring process, which is the framework of everything that's going on right now, either gets approved or it doesn't get approved. I'm no Austrian law expert. I don't know what quite happens if it doesn't get approved. I assume not good in big block capital letters, not good. But if it does get approved, then at least we will go into the MotoGP season with some clarity over the future of MotoGP, which in the off season we've had precious little. Today we feel like we have a little bit more. Maybe in a month's time we'll have all the clarity we need.